Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a Nubian dawn, the kind of morning where the desert hasn't quite decided whether to warm up or stay drowsy, and the sky hangs in that soft bluish haze that makes everything look half-remembered. You're standing there, bare feet in cool sand, shoulders hunched slightly because the air still carries a leftover shiver from the night, watching the first baker shuffle out of a mud brick doorway. The baker crouches, tests yesterday's ashes with his fingertips. Still cold, no stray embers. He mutters something that sounds like typical, which you interpret as not enough heat left over for an easy start. That's your first quirky tidbit of the night. Many Nubian bakers genuinely hoped for a bit of ember overlap, the same way modern people pray their phone still has 5% battery when they forgot to charge it. A stronger gust sweeps through, rattling baskets and fluttering linen covers. The bakers react instantly, pulling up the reed screen, tightening a corner with a clay weight, and adjusting the oven mouth with a stone wedge. You can feel the shift. Temperature steadies again, just a touch warmer. You're starting to understand this place the way you understand a messy friend's apartment. It looks chaotic until you've spent enough time in it to realize everything has a place and purpose. Now about that open scholarly debate. You overhear two older bakers discussing how ancient winds behaved centuries ago, long before climate shifts repatterned desert currents. Historians still argue whether Nubian communities designed ovens based on stable long-term wind patterns or whether they adapted every few generations as the desert subtly shifted its behavior. The older bakers imitate exaggerated memory of the wind storytelling that makes you grin. You don't understand the dialect perfectly, but the vibe is universal. Kids these days, they don't pay attention to the wind like we used to. Even thousands of years later, that energy hasn't changed. Through the late afternoon, the wind keeps its mischief up, but the bakers stay a step ahead. They demonstrate the subtle trick of letting hot air escape without letting sand in, tilting a pot lid, propping a tool handle, shifting their bodies to act as human shields. You try it once and end up coughing dramatically, earning a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. It helps. A little. By now you can see how much wind mastery defines the success of Nubian baking. The ovens are brilliant, but the environment is the real boss. The bakers aren't fighting it. They're playing along, nudging it, coaxing it, predicting it the way seasoned sailors read currents. It's strangely soothing to watch, like a slow dance between fire and air, with sand as the over-enthusiastic backup dancer who really wants attention. As the sun begins dipping, the heat softens, the wind mellows, and the ovens settle into a steady evening rhythm. You exhale, maybe realizing only now how much tension you held bracing for the next gust. The bakers give you a nod, subtle but approving. You handled the desert winds, barely, but still. You brush sand from your clothes, again, and get ready to follow the group as the day drifts toward whatever comes next. You follow the bakers as the wind finally settles into a calmer whisper, and the late afternoon light drops into that golden, honeyed glow that makes every mud brick wall look like it was painted by a very relaxed, slightly lazy sun god. You step out from the oven yard and trail behind your guides as they start walking toward the river's edge. Not because baking is done, oh no, you're nowhere near done, but because you're about to see how wildly different Nubian bread can be depending on which community you wander into. Same desert, same river, same sun trying to roast you like a leftover grain cake, yet the variations are subtle and surprisingly charming. You kick off this little regional tour standing between two worlds, the Nile-side villages with their cooler breezes and richer soils, and the desert edge hamlets perched out where the sands creep forward like shy but persistent cats. And here comes your mainstream historical fact of the day. Ancient Nubia wasn't a uniform culture. It was a constellation of communities stretching from Lower Nubia up through the kingdom of Kush, each with its own micro-traditions in food, trade, and architecture. So naturally, their baking had range. Actual, meaningful, flavor-changing range. And you're about to taste that difference one dusty footstep at a time. You watch him loosen a few flakes of charcoal, humming softly in a tune that might be older than writing. You find yourself walking with a small bundle of ingredients tied over your shoulder like some ancient foodie pilgrim. The bakers laugh because, according to them, you're carrying it like a child holding a confused goose. You don't even ask for clarification. You don't want to know. That's joke number one. As you approach the riverbank settlement, the first variation hits you immediately. The smell. It's lighter here, almost grassy, thanks to the grains grown in irrigation-fed fields. The dough here tends to be softer, more hydrated, shaped into flatter, wider rounds that blister beautifully in the hot ovens. The bakers crack open a cooling basket to show you pale golden crust, a soft dusting of bran, and a faint earthy aroma that practically says, "Hey, you've been chewing sand all morning, so here's something merciful." Someone slices off a corner for you, and it's gentle, mild, like bread that wants to be your friend but doesn't talk too much. There's a soft chew, nothing dramatic, the kind of loaf a family might make for everyday meals. No fuss, no fancy festival shapes, no spices to show off. This is we eat this everyday bread, and honestly, it's kind of a relief after everything you've endured so far. Now contrast that with the desert edge communities you wander toward next. The air dries out again, the sand goes crunch under your feet, and somewhere in the distance, a goat screams for absolutely no reason. Classic goat behavior. Joke number two. These outer settlement bakers use grittier grain blends. Millet, sorghum, barley, whatever grows best where the river doesn't quite reach. The dough is firmer, darker, and often mixed with herbs or even a splash of fermented grain water to boost flavor and freshness. They shape the loaves narrower and taller, like little cylinders or thick discs, because these keep better in dry heat. The texture is rougher too, still good, but definitely with more personality. It has that your jaw will get a workout buddy energy. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Some desert communities added crushed wild seeds, not for flavor, but for superstition. They believed the seeds anchored the bread to the earth, making it less likely to spoil. Scientists today would call it fiber. The ancients called it protection against wandering spirits. Tomato. Tomato. As the sun dips further, you reach a third community closer to trade routes, and their bread is the wild card. They mix imported wheat, finer, whiter, pricier, with local grains to create a hybrid loaf that feels strangely modern. Richer aroma, softer interior, even a hint of sweetness. This is the ancient equivalent of someone saying, "Oh, we get our flour from the good market." And everyone around them nods with that quiet envy people have had since the dawn of civilization. Listening to the bakers across these communities chat and sometimes argue about technique is its own form of entertainment. One group swears by long fermentations, another insists on immediate baking. One says flat loaves are superior for oven heat, another claims tall loaves catch the blessing of the fire better. A donkey brace somewhere, not aggressively, just letting everyone know it exists. The sky brightens another shade. The village begins to unfurl. A woman carrying a pot of river water. An old man sweeping sand out of a doorway as though sand is something that can be defeated. Children squabbling about who gets which reed toy. You're part of the morning now. Your modern worries dissolving into this mundane choreography of chores and pre-breakfast plans. You even catch a scholarly debate moment. Historians still argue whether these variations developed from environmental necessity or from cultural identity, each region proudly maintaining its own recipe just to assert, "We're not them. We bake our bread this way." By the time you're trekking back toward the central village, your head is full of flavors, your clothes are full of sand, and your stomach is full of bread. Samples you definitely weren't supposed to eat all at once. But hey, when someone hands you ancient Nubian carbs, turning them down feels rude. As dusk deepens, the differences you observe start to blend into a single tapestry in your mind. River loaves, desert loaves, hybrid trade route loaves, all variations on the same instinctive human desire to turn grain, heat, and patience into something nourishing. And weirdly enough, despite all the regional differences, you can feel a common heartbeat in all of them. Resilience, creativity, and a quiet kind of pride. You pause for a moment, looking across the darkening horizon as distant ovens glow like tiny lanterns. Somewhere behind you, a baker pats your shoulder and hands you a small, wrapped piece of bread for later. You accept it like it's a sacred relic. They laugh. It seems you've earned your place as the earnest, overeager newbie of the day. You settle back into the village just as the first stars appear. ready to follow the next thread of this long, warm story. You wander back toward the marketplace with the faint glow of oven embers still clinging to your clothes, and suddenly the air shifts. It's busier here, noisier. Well, noisy for ancient Nubia, which mostly means a handful of traders debating loudly over grain prices, while a donkey judges everyone in silence. You follow the bakers into this gentle chaos because tonight, you're learning how trade shaped not just their flour bins, but their entire baking identity. The Nile market is like the region's slow-beating heart. Boats drift in with the lazy confidence of creatures that know the river will always take care of them, loaded with sacks of grain, jars of oils, bundles of reeds, and tools you've never seen before. This is your mainstream fact for the evening. Nubia sat at a major corridor between Central Africa and the Mediterranean world, so its markets served as lively handoff points for goods, ideas, and ingredients. And you're about to see how those outside influences snuck right into the bread. One trader unloads sacks marked with symbols you don't recognize. He cracks one open and, hello, this flour is incredibly fine. It's wheat, but not the coarse, earthy wheat grown locally. This stuff feels almost silky between your fingers. The bakers immediately surround the bag like curious cats discovering a new box. One of them nudges you and whispers, "This is the good flour." You believe him. It feels like something fancy enough to have a personality. They scoop out handfuls with practiced ease, examining the texture, the smell, the moisture. You watch their faces light up, not in a "we're going to bake something groundbreaking" way, but more of a "maybe tonight's bread won't fight us back" kind of hope. That's joke number one. The baker wipes his hands on his linen wrap and motions for you to come closer. As you step across the courtyard, you smell, not bread yet, but the layered sense of a place that depends on routine. There's the earthy sweetness of clay warmed by the still sleepy sun, the faint mineral tang of the Nile, carried by a breeze that has traveled across reed beds, crocodile territories, and the quiet splash of fishing boats. You drift with them to a quieter corner where locals mill other grains by hand. Millet, sorghum, barley. The contrast hits you. Imported wheat is glamorous, almost too smooth, while local grains are tough, honest, and unapologetically textured. Together, though, they make blends that balance flavor, durability, and cost. And that blend is the secret sauce, well, secret flour, of ancient Nubian bread. A baker shows you a new tool acquired from traders upriver, a flat wooden sifter that looks simple but is surprisingly clever. It helps separate finer flour from bran, speeding up the process and making softer loaves possible. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some traders claim these sifters were blessed by river spirits, promising fewer baking failures. Historians today would call that marketing. Speaking of historians, here's your scholarly debate for the section. Historians still argue whether Nubians preferred imported grains for their texture or whether they adopted them mostly because of status signaling. Did they genuinely like the flavor, or did imported wheat simply let them brag to their neighbors? Look at us with our fancy flour. We're practically royalty. The debate lives on. The scene shifts when a long-distance caravan rolls in. Dusty, exhausted, but carrying bundles of dried herbs and crystallized honey from far-off regions. Suddenly, the baker's creative gears start turning. A pinch of an herb here, a drizzle of sweetener there, and you've got festival bread, celebratory bread, or the boss is visiting tonight, let's impress them bread. You watch as the bakers make deals. Goods aren't just purchased. They're negotiated with storytelling, compliments, mild exaggeration, and occasionally bribing someone's kid with a small piece of fresh flatbread. One trader even tries to impress you specifically by offering the cleanest barley in all Nubia, which is a bold claim given you can literally see sand inside the bag. That's joke number two. As the crowd thins with the lowering sun, you join the bakers walking back to their ovens with their new treasures. Their steps are light, the kind of light that comes from knowing tonight's bread will have a twist. They spread out their purchases like gleeful chefs, wheat that softens crumb, barley that adds strength, millet that gives flavor, herbs that perfume the air, tools that shave minutes off preparation. You observe quietly as they test blends, sprinkle imported flour in small, cautious amounts, and tap the dough like they're listening to its secrets. You notice something subtle. The blend determines not only texture, but how the loaf interacts with heat. Fine wheat browns quickly, sometimes too quickly if you're not watching. Coarse grains bake sturdier, forgiving your occasional distraction when a goat wanders by doing something suspicious. Joke number 3. Someone hands you a crude wooden scoop and asks you to pour a mix of local and imported flour into a bowl. You hold the scoop like you're diffusing an explosive, shaking flour everywhere except the bowl. A toddler watching you shakes his head with the disappointment of a tiny, ancient Gordon Ramsay. Once the doughs rest, the bakers gather around a small fire and talk about the old days when trade wasn't as frequent. Some claim the bread tasted better then, pure, simple, straightforward. Others say imported goods made life easier and more flavorful. You realize something important. This isn't just food, it's identity. Every bag of flour that arrives shifts the character of a community, just a little. The wind picks up again, carrying the scent of dried herbs. The market fades behind you, becoming part of the night rhythm. You step into the glow of the ovens again, the flames licking up into the dark, ready to meet the new grains mixed under your watchful, mildly incompetent supervision. And there's the unmistakable hint of yesterday's baking. Toasted grain, a whisper of smoke, a smell that makes your stomach perk up like, hey, carbs? And as dough rises in its baskets, you begin to understand the full picture. Nubian baking isn't just about ovens and heat and timing. It's about currents of trade, of influence, of culture drifting along the Nile, shaping each loaf into a quiet record of human connection. You trudge along the narrow Nilebank path as dawn blushes over the desert, the sand turning a soft apricot under your bare feet. The air smells faintly of soot and crushed grains, a scent that has clung to Nubian bakeries for centuries. Today you join a small cluster of bakers tending to communal ovens carved directly into the sun-warmed earth. Cylindrical structures that look as if they sprouted from the sand itself. Each oven radiates a gentle, almost hypnotic heat, and you can hear the subtle hiss of moisture escaping from dough as it meets the hot stone interior. You probably won't survive a modern baking day here, but that's the charm. You are immersed in a rhythm older than most cities. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your current location and local time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch as a baker slides a loaf onto a wooden paddle, then carefully nudges it into the oven's dark mouth. The bread hisses and pops, a small symphony of heat meeting moisture. Historians still argue whether these ovens were influenced more by Egyptian designs or developed independently in Nubia. But you notice subtle differences. The stone retains warmth far longer, allowing multiple loaves to bake sequentially without reigniting the fire. You bend down to touch the exterior, feeling residual heat like a gentle hand resting on your wrist, and imagine a whole village relying on this steady output for daily sustenance. A fringe study once suggested that some bakers would add crushed date pits to their loaves to create a slightly crunchy texture, something like a natural granola surprise that modern supermarkets might label artisanal. Nearby, a small child, probably 6 or 7, watches the process with wide eyes. In a moment of daring, the child dips a fingertip into a mound of fresh dough. You chuckle softly, imagining how your mother would have reacted if you'd done the same. The baker simply winks and gently scoops the finger back into the mixture. You follow this, shaping loaves in your own hands. Each pat of the dough is soft but resilient, almost like the desert sand under your feet, forgiving yet firm. A cool breeze ripples across the river, rustling palms, and you realize that the scent of baking bread and the subtle fragrance of wild acacia are somehow perfectly aligned. As the loaves bake, you notice patterns etched into their tops, simple incisions forming diamonds or triangles. These marks serve multiple purposes, releasing steam, differentiating types of bread, and, according to a quirky account from a traveling merchant, occasionally signaling secret messages about which batches contained hidden herbs or seeds. Historians still debate the accuracy of this claim, but you decide that the idea of coated bread in the desert is quietly thrilling. You run your fingers over the markings, imagining that each cut tells a story, And perhaps, just perhaps, you understand why Nubian bakers took such pride in their craft. Smoke drifts lazily from one oven as the next batch prepares, curling into the warm sky. A neighbor tosses in dried reeds to encourage a gentle, smoky aroma that doesn't overpower the bread, but adds an almost imperceptible layer of flavor. You inhale deeply, and for a moment, you forget the modern world, the ticking clocks, the glowing screens. He lifts a basket containing the day's first ingredients, and you notice how minimal it is. Grain, a bit coarsely ground, salt, water, maybe a pinch of herbs if someone is feeling fancy. Ancient Nubian bread didn't need to be showy. It just needed to exist. You watch him check the ground for scorpions, not because scorpions are a big problem here, but because you never want to find the one day they are. And then he begins clearing space around the oven. The village is alive with the soft murmurs of people and animals, the occasional squawk of a distant ibis, and the reassuring rhythm of loaves sliding into hot ovens. A fringe report once claimed bakers would sometimes leave a tiny loaf outside for the river spirits, a ritual that seems more charming than ominous, and you hum along, pretending to bless your own creations. By late morning, the oven's heat has mellowed, leaving a gentle warmth radiating across the compacted earth. The loaves emerge, golden and firm, a tangible reward for patience and precision. You notice that some breads have a subtle sweetness, perhaps from the flour sifting through different grains harvested along the Nile, reminding you that food here is a tapestry of the environment and culture. Historians still argue whether certain grain types were imported from far southern regions or cultivated locally, but your senses tell you that flavor is as much about air, water, and sunlight as it is about human hands. Sitting cross-legged, you break a loaf and pass pieces around. The bread is warm, soft, and fragrant, with a slightly crunchy crust. You chew slowly, letting the taste settle in, a simple harmony of earth, water, and fire. The child laughs, mimicking your slow bites, and you realize that these ovens do more than bake bread. They bind generations together. A distant fisherman calls across the river, perhaps inviting someone to lunch, and you notice how integral the smell and sight of freshly baked bread is in prompting everyday interactions. Quirky details emerge in conversation, like a mention that some bakers sprinkle tiny bits of crushed river shells to adjust mineral content, a practice you wouldn't imagine outside of experimental cooking shows. As the sun climbs higher, the village hums with mundane activity, water drawn from the Nile, animals grazing, merchants preparing their carts, but your mind lingers on the heat, smell, and gentle rhythm of the ovens. Every loaf carries a small story, the touch of a child, the slight crackle of crust, the faint imprint of a baking paddle. You notice shadows creeping across the sand, and you think about how this ancient technique has endured, quietly anchoring the community. Historians still debate the precise evolution of these ovens, but from where you sit, observing, feeling, and tasting, there is no question that they are the heartbeat of desert life. Finally, as the day edges toward afternoon, the ovens cool just enough to allow repair and cleaning. Small repairs are made using clay and reeds, a simple maintenance routine repeated for centuries. You knead leftover dough into small rolls for later baking, watching the subtle variations in texture that occur depending on which oven chamber they were intended for. You remember the first sections of your day, the hiss of dough, the smoky aroma, the soft hum of the village. All of it culminates in this simple, profound moment of calm. A fringe note in a forgotten journal suggested bakers sometimes recited short poems to encourage the dough to rise, an endearing ritual that makes you smile. By late afternoon, the loaves have cooled enough to distribute among the village. You watch hands pass bread, exchange greetings, and share small stories, realizing that what began as a simple act of baking has become a quiet celebration of human connection. The sun dips lower, and you imagine the desert ovens glowing faintly in memory, the stones still holding warmth like a heartbeat beneath the sand. A child runs past, shrieking with joy, because apparently his morning assignment is being noisy. The baker barely flinches. This sort of noise is the heartbeat of the village, predictable, oddly soothing, and way better than the sound of your upstairs neighbor vacuuming at 11 p.m. Historians still argue whether this style of baking influenced neighboring regions, But you think perhaps it doesn't really matter. You've been here, and that in itself is enough. You wander along the village edge as evening softens the light, a gentle haze settling over the Nile and casting long shadows from the acacia trees. The day's warmth lingers in the sand and the cooled ovens, carrying the faint aroma of toasted grain and smoke. You notice a few remaining loaves stacked on woven mats, their golden crusts now quiet and firm, waiting for the night to carry them into the hands of villagers. You probably won't survive a modern attempt to replicate this rhythm, but the slow pace is comforting, almost hypnotic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, leave a note of your location in local time. It's fascinating to imagine the sun setting on someone else's slice of earth. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The village begins to settle, but the baker's day is not yet done. You watch as a woman carefully stokes the embers left in one of the desert ovens, coaxing the remaining heat into a gentle, uniform glow. Historians still argue whether these ovens were originally designed for efficiency or ritual significance, but their continued use speaks to a balance between practicality and tradition. You kneel beside her, noting how the heat radiates in gentle waves, warming your hands as you shape small portions of dough into slender sticks. A quirky record mentions that some bakers added a pinch of powdered hibiscus petals to the dough for a subtle reddish tint, more for fun than necessity, and you imagine how these tiny flourishes brought cheer to the monotony of daily baking. Nearby, goats amble past, their hooves soft against the sand, and you hear the distant clatter of fishermen mending nets by the riverbank. You flatten another portion of dough, realizing that even the smallest movements in baking are rhythmic, almost meditative. The clay ovens, still warm, seem to pulse under your touch, as if the earth itself remembers centuries of hands shaping bread. You recall the earlier trick of marking loaves with shallow cuts. Tonight, you carve a small triangle into one, imagining it as a secret message for the future, a little wink across generations. As night deepens, the bakers share small anecdotes, some true, some exaggerated. One whispers about how a certain oven chamber tends to bake loaves slightly sweeter, and you tilt your head, trying to detect the difference with your senses. Historians still debate whether these variations are accidental or carefully cultivated knowledge passed down orally, but the playful tone makes you smile. You run your hands over the textured surfaces of the bread, feeling the cool crust give way slightly under gentle pressure, marveling at the continuity of this craft. A fringe study once suggested that some Nubian bakers sang low tones near the ovens, believing that the vibrations helped the dough rise more consistently. You hum along quietly, feeling oddly soothed, as if the hum resonates through the stones and into your chest. The smell of residual smoke mingles with the subtle sweetness of the finished bread, creating an ambiance both grounding and almost ethereal. He scoops sand away from the oven's base, checking airflow. The design is simple but brilliant. A dome traps heat, a small opening funnels it, and the desert itself acts as insulation. You lean close, fascinated by the craftsmanship, and for a moment you imagine building one yourself, until you remember you once tried assembling a bookshelf in the bookshelf one. You take a piece of cooled bread, break it into small chunks, and taste the lingering warmth, noting the gentle crunch followed by a soft, yielding center. In the dim light, you observe how each baker has a distinct style. One prefers elongated loaves, another small round ones. The variety is small but meaningful, hinting at subtle preferences developed over decades. You think about how these choices influence daily life. Which bread goes to children, which to elders, and which to travelers passing through. The village hums with quiet movement, and for a moment you forget time, focusing instead on tactile sensation, scent, and the reassuring pattern of hands moving through flour. By late evening, the ovens have cooled fully, leaving a gentle residual warmth that the sand absorbs. You watch the bakers sweep the area clean, picking up stray grains and embers, a process repeated countless times over generations. Historians still debate whether such meticulous care was driven more by hygiene or by ritual respect for the earth. But as you sit on the soft sand, the answer feels unimportant. There's a quiet meditation in the repetitive gestures, a calm rhythm that invites reflection. You recall the little child from earlier, now yawning and rubbing their eyes. They tuck into a small loaf as a reward for being patient throughout the day. You smile, imagining the continuity of these traditions, the transfer of skill, patience, and subtle tricks like the occasional addition of date pits or hibiscus powder. Each gesture, each loaf is a thread linking the present to centuries of history, binding people to place and to one another. Finally, you step back and survey the village under the starry canopy. The desert ovens, now dormant, seem like gentle sentinels guarding both sustenance and memory. Smoke has vanished, yet the warmth in your chest remains, a lingering echo of bread, fire, and human rhythm. Fringe stories, debated histories, and sensory experiences all meld into a single, calming panorama. You inhale deeply, letting the faint scent of cooled flour and acacia fill your lungs, realizing that even the simplest acts of daily life, kneading dough, tending fire, can carry an entire culture forward. The Nile whispers softly in the night, and the village exhales along with it. You feel grounded, connected, and unexpectedly calm, as though you've absorbed centuries of patient, deliberate labor without even realizing it. Historians may still argue over techniques and origins, but what matters now is the lived, tactile reality you've experienced. Each loaf, each ember, each quiet smile contributes to the gentle heartbeat of this desert community. And as you settle down beside the cooling ovens, you notice that time, much like bread, has a rhythm meant to be savored slowly. Night drapes over the village like a soft, dark quilt, and the desert cools into gentle shadows. You trudge softly past the last remaining ovens, now silent except for the faint radiance of residual heat. The air carries a mixture of sand, smoke, and something subtly sweet from the day's baking, an aroma that clings to your clothes and hair. The sun creeps higher, painting the courtyard in that gentle gold that makes everything look slightly magical. Even the chicken pecking at nothing. The baker stretches, cracks his knuckles, and gives you a look that says, "Time to get to work." You nod back, pretending you're ready for a full shift in an ancient desert bakery, even though realistically, you'd be Googling how to survive without air conditioning within 10 minutes. You probably won't survive an entire week living this slow, rhythmic life, but for tonight, it's enough to simply observe and breathe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to leave your location and local time. It's oddly comforting to imagine someone else experiencing nightfall in tandem. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow a narrow path toward the river, where moonlight dances off the rippling water. The gentle hiss of leftover embers from the ovens fades into the background, replaced by soft frog calls and the occasional flap of a nightbird. Historians still argue whether Nubian baking rituals were strictly practical or infused with symbolic meaning, but observing the villagers' careful tending to ovens and ingredients, you sense a mixture of both. You kneel beside a small pile of flour that escaped earlier preparation, feeling its cool, dusty texture between your fingers. A quirky account suggests some bakers would whisper short verses to the flour, believing it imbued bread with patience, an endearing superstition you hum along with as you sift it lightly. Back at the village edge, a few loaves remain, covered with woven mats to protect them from the desert chill and roaming animals. You notice how even these simple coverings are expertly arranged, leaving small gaps to allow air circulation. This attention to detail seems minor, yet it reflects a deep understanding of the balance between heat, moisture, and texture. A fringe report once claimed bakers would sometimes let the night air kiss the dough to enhance flavor. A poetic exaggeration, perhaps, but somehow convincing as you watch the breeze curl over the mats. You gently pat one loaf, feeling its firmness and subtle warmth, a reminder that the day's labor is both ephemeral and lasting. Nearby, a faint discussion rises among a few villagers returning from the riverbank. They exchange stories of small triumphs, a loaf that rose just right, a new technique to manage the oven's heat, or the unexpected crunch of a date pit in a batch. You listen, amused by the subtle humor embedded in these seemingly mundane details. Historians still debate whether such nuanced knowledge was formally taught or passed down informally, Yet observing it firsthand, you sense a seamless combination of tradition and improvisation. You shape a small portion of leftover dough for a trial loaf, pressing lightly and imagining how the oven's residual warmth will transform it. As the moon rises higher, silvering the sand and casting long shadows across the village, you reflect on the subtle choreography of daily life here. Even the night has its own rhythm, the cooling of the ovens, the gentle hum of insects, the soft occasional splash of the Nile. You hum along with the night sounds, thinking about the quirky historical notes, the crushed date pits, the whispered flower poems, and tiny ritual offerings that add a human warmth to the practical work. It feels as though every loaf, ember, and gesture is a conversation across time, a quiet dialogue between generations. As he arranges his tools, you sense the rhythm forming, quiet motions, deliberate gestures, long pauses that seem designed to let you breathe with the morning instead of fighting it. This entire environment is a masterclass in slow living, something your modern brain finds baffling yet comforting. A child now yawning and leaning against a low wall offers a small piece of bread as a gift, smiling shyly. You accept it, noting the delicate crunch and warm interior. The simplicity of this gesture seems profoundly meaningful, a reminder that community and sustenance are intertwined in ways far more intimate than modern routines allow. Historians still argue about the precise dietary role of Nubian bread in daily nutrition, but you notice how it nourishes more than just the body. It nourishes connection, patience, and observation. A gentle wind rises, carrying faint scents of acacia blossoms and distant cooking fires. You trace the curve of a palm leaf, noticing its shadow shifting across a pile of small loaves. In this moment, you sense that each object, the oven, the bread, the sand, and even the scattered flour, is part of a subtle ecosystem of care and labor. Fringe studies note that some bakers believed in synchronizing dough kneading with the moon's phases, an idea that sounds whimsical, yet somehow feels fitting under the moonlit sky. You knead your small loaf again, letting your fingers slowly imprint patterns that seem to whisper back the day's rhythm. Observing the last movements of the village, you see elders checking that embers are safely banked and children securing mats of bread for tomorrow. The ovens, once fiercely alive with heat, are now dormant, their internal stones radiating gentle warmth like a heartbeat slowing to rest. You pause, running your hand along the cool exterior, and imagine countless generations performing the same gestures, breathing the same air, kneading the same grains. Historians still debate whether these techniques influence neighboring cultures, but tonight you feel the legacy without questioning it, an unbroken thread of daily life, patience, and quiet ingenuity. You settle near one of the stone ovens, feeling its residual warmth seep into your back. The air grows cooler, softer, carrying only the faintest traces of flour, smoke, and wild desert herbs. A fringe tale comes to mind about a baker who supposedly embedded tiny charms into loaves to protect families from misfortune, a story that seems more whimsical than factual, yet charming nonetheless. You hum a low, calming tune, letting the rhythm echo the slow heat of the stones, the gentle flow of the Nile, and the quiet endurance of human hands shaping sustenance. The village gradually hushes, leaving you alone with subtle nocturnal murmurs and the comforting solidity of the earth beneath you. Each loaf, each ember, each gentle gesture is a soft testimony to centuries of patience and quiet craftsmanship. You chew another piece of cooled bread, savoring its texture and subtle flavors, and notice how even simple sustenance can feel profound when observed slowly and attentively. Historians still argue about the origins of certain grains, but you realize that what matters most is their presence here, alive in the hands of the bakers and the mouths of the villagers. He yawns, you yawn, and honestly, you probably won't survive this morning routine if you're expecting anything fast-paced or dramatic. Here, everything moves like honey in winter, slow, steady, unbothered by your modern rush brain. A soft wind carries a few grains of sand across your ankles. Somewhere along the riverbank, a fisherman calls out to his partner. Life opens gradually in Nubia, like a book people know by heart, but still reread every day. By the end of the night, you feel the gentle cadence of time itself, echoing in the cooling ovens, the sand, and your own relaxed breathing. The day's baking is complete, Yet its echoes linger, creating a soft hum of history, human touch, and shared sustenance. You lean back, feeling your limbs relax, noticing how the simple act of being present transforms the ordinary into a serene, meditative experience. Fringe traditions, scholarly debates, and subtle quirks all blend into a comforting lullaby of human persistence and rhythm. The early hours of the next morning arrive quietly, with a lavender-tinged sky and a soft breeze carrying the faint scent of sand and river mist. You trudge along the familiar path toward the ovens, noticing the gentle dew on scattered grains that escaped yesterday's labor. You probably won't survive trying to keep pace with the seasoned bakers here, but today you're content to observe, to let each motion and smell imprint in your memory. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And leave your location and local time, because it's oddly satisfying to imagine a synchronized sunrise somewhere else. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pause beside one oven, running your hand across the still warm stones, and feeling the residual heat pulse gently beneath your fingertips. Historians still argue whether these ovens were developed from Egyptian designs or were purely Nubian innovation, but the differences are subtle. The internal temperature is maintained longer, allowing for multiple rounds of bread without rekindling the fire. A quirky record suggests some bakers would hide small pebbles in dough, believing it could ward off sleepy spirits from meddling with the bread's rise. A superstition that seems charming in the context of this otherwise practical craft. Nearby, a small child giggles as they roll leftover dough into tiny balls, imitating the motions of older bakers. You kneel beside them, gently guiding their fingers, noticing how even this simple act of tactile repetition becomes a lesson in patience. The ovens, now glowing faintly from the embers banked overnight, seem to hum along with your movements, radiating warmth that feels both physical and oddly reassuring. Historians still debate whether the tradition of children helping with dough was primarily educational, ritualistic, or simply a practical necessity, but watching it unfold, the answer appears beautifully multifaceted. A breeze rustles through palm fronds, carrying the subtle aroma of toasted grains and faint smoke. You shape a portion of dough, letting it rest while the embers regain their steady glow. Fringe accounts mention that bakers sometimes added a tiny pinch of river clay to their flour, believing it enhanced texture, something that modern bakers would never attempt. Yet you are oddly curious to feel the difference. You pat the dough, folding it gently, and note the subtle elasticity that has been perfected over generations of trial, error, and observation. And here you are, standing beside a clay oven just beginning to wake up with the world, ready to learn exactly how ancient Nubian bakers perfected their craft, one calm, sandy morning at a time. You stay close to the oven as the morning stretches out, and the baker gives you a gesture, half invitation, half warning, that says, "All right, now you're really going to see how this thing works." You notice the placement of the ovens, strategically aligned with the sun and prevailing winds to maximize airflow. Small details like this suggest a sophisticated understanding of environmental factors, even if it was acquired through centuries of careful experimentation rather than formal study. A quirky note in an old journal mentions that some bakers would perform a short dance before opening an oven, claiming it encouraged bread to greet the morning warmly. A playful gesture that makes you smile. You bend down to inspect the interior, noting the subtle discolorations in the stone from repeated use, a tactile chronicle of daily life and effort. By mid-morning, the ovens are humming steadily, and the first loaves of the day are ready for baking. You watch as a baker slides a flattened portion of dough inside, listening to the gentle hiss as it meets the hot stone. Historians still argue whether the scoring patterns on the bread, simple triangles, diamonds, and lines, served primarily functional purposes or were also a form of quiet expression. Yet the symmetry and care suggest both. A fringe record mentions that a baker once carved a miniature map of the village onto a loaf as a playful riddle for children, which makes you chuckle quietly, imagining a secret code baked into breakfast. The rhythm of baking continues, sliding dough in, rotating loaves, monitoring embers. You hum along, letting the quiet cadence lull your thoughts. Nearby, someone sprinkles a few crushed date pits into a batch, providing a subtle texture contrast. Historians still debate the prevalence of this practice, but the result is undeniably delightful. You notice how even the smallest gestures, pressing down a dough edge, adjusting a minor ember, carry a quiet authority, a knowledge accumulated and honed over generations. A soft laugh draws your attention to the children, now sneaking small pieces of unbaked dough to taste. The baker glances over, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing, letting them indulge in this tiny ritual. Fringe stories suggest that letting children sneak dough was thought to instill early patience and appreciation for labor. A charming explanation, whether factual or imagined. You smile, imagining how these moments of gentle mischief have repeated across centuries. By late morning, the loaves emerge golden, crisped at the edges, and you feel the satisfaction of observing transformation from raw dough to finished bread. You break one open, inhaling the soft, earthy aroma, tasting the faint sweetness of naturally fermented grains. Historians still debate the exact mix of flours and grains used across centuries, yet the combination in your hand is perfect for the simple purpose it serves: nourishment, tradition, and quiet joy. The village continues its gentle hum, water drawn, animals grazing, elders supervising. You notice the interconnectedness of the baking process with daily routines, a rhythm as precise as it is flexible. Fringe reports mention bakers sometimes left a small loaf outdoors as an offering to local spirits, a tiny act of respect that feels deeply human rather than superstitious. You roll another portion of dough, letting the subtle warmth of your hands guide the shape, feeling an intimate connection with the centuries of bakers who have worked the same earth. You crouch beside the dome, feeling that strange anticipatory hush that ovens seem to create, like they're living creatures waking up from a long nap. The mud brick structure looks simple at first glance, but the longer you stare, the more you realize it's basically an ancient engineering puzzle disguised as a humble kitchen appliance. By midday, the ovens have mellowed, leaving behind a comforting radiance. You pause, feeling the sun on your back, inhaling the layered scents of smoke, grain, and desert flora. The bakers tidy their area, picking up stray embers and flour, gestures that repeat a timeless cycle of care and attention. Historians still argue about whether such attention was practical, ritualistic, or a blend, but the pattern exudes a calming constancy that transcends scholarly debate. You chew a small piece of freshly baked bread, letting its subtle textures anchor your thoughts in the present, in the quiet rhythm of daily life. As afternoon approaches, the ovens are finally cooled, and you take a last slow stroll around the village. Each stone, each loaf, each ember feels charged with centuries of human rhythm, patience, and subtle artistry. Fringe traditions, whispered stories, and playful experiments all blend into a tactile tapestry that is at once practical and whimsical. You notice shadows stretching longer across the sand, and you feel that timeless, quiet pulse, the heartbeat of life shaped by hands, heat, and gentle observation. The afternoon sun softens, casting a honeyed glow over the village and reflecting off the gentle ripples of the Nile. You trudge past the ovens, now quiet, but still exuding residual warmth, and feel the comforting weight of centuries of practice beneath your fingertips. You probably won't survive an entire week keeping this rhythm, but for now you settle into the quiet observation of life unfolding. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do leave a comment with your location and local time, because it's strangely satisfying to imagine the sun elsewhere on a parallel schedule. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You notice small details that often go unnoticed. A tiny crack in an oven's stone, softened over decades, the gentle tilt of a baking paddle well worn from repeated use, the faint imprint of past loaves left in dusted flour. Historians still argue whether these subtle distinctions were intentionally preserved or naturally occurred over time, but they tell a story all the same. A quirky account mentions that some bakers would whisper to the dough before placing it in the oven, believing that encouraging words improved its texture, a whimsical ritual that now seems oddly comforting as you hum along quietly. Nearby, children play with leftover scraps of dough, shaping miniature loaves and pretending to bake them. You kneel down, lightly dusting flour on your hands and joining in, and feel the tactile rhythm of kneading, pressing, and folding. The ovens, though dormant, seem to radiate a quiet pulse in response, like a heartbeat that has synchronized with human motion across centuries. Fringe reports suggest that this playful training was considered essential to passing down knowledge subtly, embedding patience and dexterity in the next generation. You fold a small piece into a soft ball, watching it hold its shape against your gentle pressure. He taps the outer wall with his knuckles, listening. You try the same and mostly hear the sound of yourself being confused, but he's nodding, satisfied, because he's reading the oven like a stethoscope. Here's your mainstream historical fact woven in like steam. Nubian ovens, called tanur in some regions, were constructed with layers of clay mixed with straw, sand, and sometimes crushed potsherds. The combination made them resilient, heat-retaining, and surprisingly long-lived. You observe the positioning of each oven and notice how airflow, sun angles, and nearby water sources subtly influence baking outcomes. Even the smallest movement of embers or grains can affect the crust or rise. Historians still debate whether these ovens were deliberately aligned for maximum efficiency or if such refinements arose through trial and error. Yet the precision you witness speaks to a deep, intuitive understanding of environment and technique. You gently touch a smooth stone, imagining the hands that shaped it, and feel a quiet reverence for centuries of careful labor. The faint smell of smoke lingers as villagers go about afternoon routines, mending nets, drawing water, feeding animals. You knead a small portion of dough, folding it gently, and feel how the texture changes slightly with each press. A fringe note mentions that bakers sometimes incorporated tiny crushed seeds or nuts from local flora to experiment with flavor and texture, a charming early form of culinary improvisation. You hum softly, letting the motion of your hands and the warmth of residual stones carry you into a meditative rhythm. As you handle the dough, you think about the scoring marks etched into each loaf, the tiny triangles and lines meant for steam release, but also potentially for communication. Historians still argue whether these patterns carried secret messages, regional identifiers, or simply were functional. Yet you find joy in imagining a hidden language baked into the bread. You gently press the dough into one of these familiar patterns, feeling an unspoken connection with the bakers who have done the same for generations. A gentle breeze lifts from the river, brushing across your cheeks and carrying a hint of wildflowers. You watch as elders arrange leftover flour into neat piles, and younger bakers sweep the courtyard, gestures repeated countless times over decades. Fringe stories suggest these gestures were partly ritual, a sign of respect for the tools and ingredients, though the practical benefits are evident in the cleanliness of the space. You inhale the soft, layered aromas, flour, smoke, river, and sand, and let the rhythm of work, smell, and tactile engagement settle your mind. You pause to observe a small loaf resting on a woven mat, its crust now cooled and firm. It feels weighty in your hands, carrying both literal nourishment and the intangible history of human patience. A quirky anecdote mentions that some bakers would leave tiny crumbs for the birds, perhaps to encourage good fortune, a practice that seems more charming than meaningful, yet somehow fits perfectly into the landscape of daily care. Historians still debate the practical significance of such gestures, but for you, the detail adds depth to the experience of observing life here. Some households treated them like family heirlooms, repairing the same oven for decades. As shadows lengthen, you need another portion of dough, noticing subtle differences in texture based on how it was handled, where it rested, and ambient moisture. The practice feels both meditative and instructive, a slow choreography that teaches patience and attention to the smallest factors. Fringe sources suggest bakers occasionally synchronize kneading with certain times of day, believing it encouraged better rise and flavor, an idea that feels whimsical but oddly resonant with the rhythm of your own breathing. You glance at the ovens one last time before the sun dips fully, their stones still retaining gentle warmth. The village around you hums with quiet activity, from children playing to elders managing small chores. Each loaf, each ember, each subtle gesture is part of a network of care, attention, and tradition. Historians still argue about the precise origins of the ovens and techniques, but from your vantage, the significance is clear. Generations of humans have lived, labored, and subtly communicated through these simple, glowing instruments of sustenance. You sit cross-legged near one oven, letting your fingers brush against the warm stone, tasting a small crumb of bread, and feeling fully immersed in this tapestry of sound, smell, and touch. A faint moonlight glimmers across the village, painting the sand and water with a soft silver hue. Fringe studies recall bakers sometimes leaving small poems or inscriptions on oven walls, adding a layer of narrative to everyday labor. Tiny whispers of human presence that survive beyond the physical objects themselves. Finally, as evening arrives, you feel the gentle cadence of time in your own breathing, synchronized with the silent warmth of the ovens and the muted movements of the villagers. Every loaf, every ember, every whisper of wind contributes to a soothing rhythm, a quiet story written in flour, fire, and care. Historians may debate the details, but the lived experience, the tangible, sensorial reality, speaks louder than any scholarly argument. You smile softly, letting the atmosphere of patience, practice, and subtle whimsy settle around you like a comforting blanket. Twilight descends and the village takes on a soft, muted glow, the last rays of sun pooling over the sand and the gentle ripple of the Nile. You trudge along the familiar paths between ovens and palm trees, the residual warmth of the stones brushing against your legs. You probably won't survive trying to replicate this entire rhythm in one day, but that doesn't matter. You are here now, observing, listening, breathing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And leave your location and local time. Imagining someone else watching the sunset elsewhere is strangely grounding. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He pats the dome and points to a faint spiral-shaped ridge circling its top. You blink. You didn't notice that before. It's subtle, worn smooth by years of handling, like the swirl on a seashell. This is your quirky tidbit. Some Nubian bakers shape the top of their ovens to help heat swirl inside more evenly, like the ancient equivalent of convection mode. Whether it actually worked is anyone's guess, but it definitely made bakers feel like they were outsmarting the desert. You notice the subtle glow of embers left in the desert ovens, fading but persistent, as if reluctant to relinquish the day's accumulated warmth. Historians still argue whether the oven's designs were inspired by Egyptian methods or entirely Nubian ingenuity. But observing the practical elegance of heat retention, you see a perfect balance between form and function. A quirky note from a traveler's journal suggests that some bakers would brush their hands across the stones and hum quietly, believing the subtle vibrations encouraged even baking, a practice that feels oddly meditative and completely in tune with the slowing day. The village stirs with gentle evening activity. Children chase one another around low stone walls while a few elders sort leftover grains, occasionally chuckling at small mishaps. You knead a piece of dough into a small loaf, noticing how pliable and soft it remains, even after the day's heat. Fringe accounts claim that bakers sometimes left tiny portions of dough outside for spirits or wandering animals, a whimsical practice that blends ritual and practicality. You pat the dough gently, imagining that each movement carries centuries of human habit and intention. The ovens, now nearly dormant, radiate a soft warmth that anchors the space. You place your hands against one stone, feeling the subtle pulse of residual heat, and remember the small gestures throughout the day. Scoring patterns, tiny touches of crushed date pits, careful ember adjustments. Historians still debate whether these minutiae were taught systematically or simply passed down through observation. But watching it firsthand, it feels like a quiet curriculum of patience and subtle mastery. A gentle wind curls across the sand, carrying hints of acacia and distant river mist. You observe the scoring on the day's loaves, the shallow triangles and diamonds, and imagine them as silent messages across generations. Fringe reports suggest some bakers would embed symbols or tiny flower marks to signal flavors or secret ingredients, an early, playful form of coded communication. You trace one faint mark with your fingertip, feeling a quiet connection with artisans long gone. Nearby, a child tries to sneak a small morsel of cooled bread. The baker raises an eyebrow but says nothing, letting the child enjoy a minor, timeless indulgence. You smile, recognizing the enduring humor and kindness embedded in these routines. Historians still argue whether children's early involvement in baking was strictly practical or part of a deeper cultural pedagogy, but the evidence of joy and learning is clear. You mold another portion of dough, letting the tactile rhythm calm your mind. The village gradually hushes as night deepens. The ovens, now inert but still radiating faint warmth, anchor the quiet space. You hear the soft lap of the river, the faint rustle of palm fronds, and the occasional low murmur from the few remaining villagers tending chores. Fringe tales claim bakers sometimes recited small rhymes or chants to their dough, ostensibly to influence rise and texture. A whimsical notion, but somehow appropriate in the soft evening air. You hum quietly along, letting your hands move with the calm, repetitive motions of shaping and kneading. You trace the spiral lightly with your fingers and feel the texture. Rough in some places, crumbly in others, but solid overall. The oven isn't just a tool, it's a patchwork biography of every pair of hands that ever built, repaired, or leaned on it. By late evening, the ovens are fully cooled, leaving only the faint glow of memory in the stones. You survey the village, scattered loaves resting under woven mats, children yawning, elders preparing for rest. The quiet, deliberate rhythm of baking and tending is etched into the space like a subtle heartbeat. Historians still debate how much of this knowledge was formalized versus orally transmitted, but the presence of skill, patience, and gentle improvisation is undeniable. You sit on the sand near a stone oven, letting the soft residual heat seep into your legs and the cool night air brush your face. Each loaf, each ember, each subtle action carries centuries of practice and human touch. Fringe anecdotes of hidden ingredients, whispered encouragements, and tiny flower rituals blend into a tapestry of patience, care, and subtle artistry. You gently press a small loaf with your fingers, feeling the texture, warmth, and quiet significance of hands shaping sustenance through generations. The moon rises higher, silvering the sand and water, casting soft shadows across the village. The oven's presence, though inert, seems to radiate a kind of quiet wisdom. You reflect on the tiny flower marks, the playful codes, the gentle guidance of elders, and the careful observation of children. Historians may still argue about origins and methods, but you sense that the human rhythm, the patience, subtle humor, and continuity is the true legacy. As night deepens, you lie back on a soft patch of sand, feeling the gentle pulse of the village and the earth. Every loaf, ember, and gesture is part of a quiet, ongoing story. The rhythm of baking, tending, and observing has become a lullaby, a steady cadence of touch, heat, smell, and human presence. Fringe traditions, scholarly debates, and subtle quirks blend into an atmosphere of calm. You close your eyes briefly, allowing the lingering warmth, scent, and soft hum of the night to fill your awareness, settling you into a gentle, reflective state. The night deepens into a velvety calm, and the village of Nubian bakers seems suspended between the river's gentle murmur and the soft sigh of the desert wind. You trudge slowly among the silent ovens, letting your hands brush against the warm stones, now barely radiating heat, and you feel the day's labor lingering in your fingertips. You probably won't survive the unbroken rhythm of centuries, but for tonight, you are fully immersed, breathing the same air and touching the same surfaces as generations before you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do leave a note of your location and local time. It's oddly soothing to picture the world elsewhere in quiet harmony. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You notice the faint imprint of footprints in the sand, your own and those of villagers moving slowly to tend the last loaves. Historians still debate how Nubian ovens influenced neighboring regions, but you feel the quiet continuity, a tactile history traced in stone, sand, and flour. A quirky account mentions that bakers sometimes hid tiny charms or pebbles in dough, a playful, almost whimsical act meant to bring luck, though its meaning now seems more human than mystical. You kneel, molding a small piece of dough, letting your hands trace patterns that echo centuries of practice. The baker lifts a clay shard lying beside the oven and uses it to scrape out loose debris from last night's fire. While he works, you examine the structure more carefully, noticing three key features: the rounded dome, the fuel opening near the base, and the upper mouth where bread will enter and exit. You've seen modern recreations of these in documentaries, but being here, knees in the sand, morning breeze brushing across your arms, makes it feel like discovering fire again. Nearby, a faint murmur rises as a child adjusts mats covering loaves, careful not to disturb the delicate crusts. The ovens, though dormant, seem to hum softly with memory, a subtle warmth that reaches your skin. Fringe reports suggest that whispered encouragements to dough were once considered standard practice, a gentle ritual to imbue patience and care into bread. You hum quietly, letting the vibration of your voice blend with the residual heat and the river's soft song. The village settles into stillness. Only the distant lap of water against reeds and the occasional rustle of a night creature punctuate the silence. You pause, taking a small piece of bread in your hands, its surface cool and firm, yet carrying faint residual warmth. Historians still argue whether variations in grain mixtures were intentional experiments or simply the result of local availability. But you notice that each loaf, even in its humble simplicity, is an embodiment of skill, adaptation, and quiet artistry. You lean against a stone oven, feeling its heat seep softly through the night. The tactile memory of kneading, folding, and shaping dough lingers in your hands, a gentle imprint of daily practice. Fringe tales speak of bakers leaving tiny poetic flour markings on ovens, small ephemeral messages passed down or observed by others, a layer of subtle communication that hints at the human desire to connect through craft. You press lightly on a cooled loaf, imagining the hands of those who shaped it centuries ago. Moonlight spills across the sand, silvering the bread and ovens, creating an atmosphere of gentle reverence. Each detail, the scoring on loaves, the texture of flour, the faint traces of smoke, carries layers of human ingenuity, ritual, and quiet joy. Historians still debate the precise methods of heat management, grain selection, and oven placement. But the lived reality is clear. Patience, repetition, and care govern every motion here. You inhale deeply, letting the complex sense of sand, smoke, and grain settle into your chest, a calming blend that connects you to this ancient craft. A soft breeze curls through the palms, brushing across the sleeping village. You sit cross-legged, tracing the texture of stones and cooled bread, reflecting on the rhythm of a day now complete. Preparation, kneading, baking, tending, and gentle communal interaction. Fringe accounts, quirky rituals, and small acts of playful creativity all combine to produce a harmonious tapestry of labor and joy. You hum quietly along, letting the simple cadence of life here anchor your mind. The oven stones are cool now, yet you can feel the history they hold, like a faint echo under your palms. Every loaf, every ember, every careful gesture reverberates across time, a testament to patience and continuity. You chew slowly on a small piece of bread, savoring its textures, subtle sweetness, and quiet aroma. Historians may still debate the exact evolution of these techniques, but the immediate experience, the sensory immersion, is undeniable. As the night stretches on, you notice how the village breathes in rhythm, children tucked under mats, elders checking on stored bread, animals quietly shifting. The Nile murmurs, the desert sighs, and you feel an encompassing sense of calm. Fringe traditions, playful flower rituals, and subtle gestures of human care blend seamlessly into this serene nocturnal tapestry. You press a hand gently against an oven, letting the residual warmth, history, and human touch radiate through you. He motions for you to check inside the oven. You lean close, careful, not wanting to bump your head like someone who underestimates ancient architecture. The inside is blackened with soot, but also surprisingly smooth. The walls have been polished over time by repeated heating and cooling cycles. The warm undertone smells like a combination of burnt wood, grain dust, and something almost sweet, like caramelized flour. Finally, as your body relaxes fully, the rhythm of the village and its ovens lulls you into a gentle awareness of the past, present, and a slow-moving timelessness. Every loaf, every ember, every small detail contributes to a quiet continuity that is both soothing and mesmerizing. Historians may still argue over origins and methods, but you feel it. The heartbeat of centuries, distilled into patience, touch, scent, and soft human presence. You close your eyes, letting the lingering warmth and subtle night sounds wrap around you, a gentle lullaby of bread, fire, and enduring craft. Historians still argue whether Nubian ovens were always communal or typically household-based. Some villages shared a large oven in the central courtyard, while others, like this one, kept smaller family ovens tucked behind their homes. You look around and see three more domes scattered across the village, each in different states of use. Their sizes vary as if each family sized their oven based on how many mouths they needed to feed or how serious their carb addiction was. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The baker gestures to the base vent, a rectangular hole where fuel will be fed. It's small but clever, positioned just low enough to suck in desert winds when needed, but angled to avoid being clogged by drifting sand. He scrapes the threshold with a bone-handled tool, working patiently. Watching him feels like watching someone tending a pet more than a machine. You shuffle back to get a fuller view, and that's when you notice the oven's companion, a squat mud brick bench pressed against the wall. This is where dough rests, where tools are set, and where gossip has undoubtedly been exchanged since the reign of whatever pharaoh before breakfast existed at the time. You sit down tentatively, half expecting it to collapse under the weight of your modern stress, but it holds firm. The baker points at the ground ring bordering the oven, a half circle of stones arranged to create a stable workspace. Even dirt needs boundaries out here. You imagine how long it took to arrange these, and how many times they've been kicked out of place, shoved back, kicked again, shoved again. Ancient baker life, surprisingly relatable. He steps back and invites you to watch as he studies the outer shell again, checking for cracks. The desert is a harsh critic. It gets into every weak spot, but the oven holds. A single hairline fracture snakes along one side, filled with a strip of darker clay. A recent repair. It makes the oven look like it has a scar, one of those cool, story-worthy ones that someone would brag about if ovens could talk. You lean closer, wondering how hot this thing will get soon. The baker notices and chuckles, the universal sign for, "I see you're clueless but respectful." He grabs a small, conical clay lid that will later cover the upper mouth during heating. The lid is decorated with a tiny etched pattern. Zigzags, the simplest art form in the world. Maybe it's random. Maybe it's sacred. Maybe it's the ancient equivalent of doodling on your notebook during a boring meeting. He hands it to you, and it's light. Surprisingly light for clay. It must have been fired thin intentionally. You run your thumb along the zigzags and feel a sudden connection to someone, somewhere, who carved this centuries ago with the same absent-minded calm you're feeling now. It's a weirdly comforting detail, like discovering ancient people fidgeted with their tools the same way you tap your phone screen when you're bored. The baker takes back the lid and gives you a nod of approval. It's not clear what exactly you've done to earn that nod, but you accept it like a badge. You study the oven's curvature again, noticing how deliberate every angle is. The dome shape encourages heat circulation. The narrow mouth traps warmth. The layered clay walls resist cracking under temperature changes. Even the height is thoughtful, just tall enough to work at without bending too much, but not so tall that you can't reach in with a paddle. A goat wanders past and headbutts the oven lightly, looking for food or existential meaning. The baker shoos it away gently, like this is a daily ritual. The goat seems offended but leaves. A single sunbeam creeps over the house wall and settles on the dome, warming its top. You watch the color shift, brightening slightly as the clay begins soaking up the day's energy. You realize you're witnessing technology that doesn't rely on electricity or timers or preheat buttons, just geometry, physics, and a whole lot of patience. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fun seeing this little sleepy community stretch across time zones. The baker claps his hands softly, dust puffing off like tiny smoke clouds, and you see the moment he decides the oven is ready to be awakened. But the real heating comes later. Right now, he wants you to understand the bones of the thing, the skeleton of an oven that will soon glow like a miniature sun. And as the desert morning stretches, you can't help but feel a little proud. You've spent the last hour studying a mud brick dome, And somehow it feels like a privilege. You shift your weight in the sand as the baker straightens his back and sweeps his gaze across the edge of the village, because now it's time to gather the day's fuel. And in Nubia, that is not a trivial errand. You're probably imagining neat stacks of firewood, maybe a bundle of logs tied with rope like something from a cozy cabin commercial. Nope. Here, fuel is a scavenger hunt conducted in a desert that wakes up crankier than you do on a Monday. The baker grabs a woven basket and gestures for you to follow. You do because what else are you going to do? Tell him you prefer electric ovens? The moment you step away from the cluster of homes, the landscape stretches open like a yawn. The sand is still cool under your feet, and every breeze carries whispers from the Nile. You inhale deeply, and the air tastes strangely metallic, as if the river and the desert negotiated a compromise, and the result was crisply neutral. Here's your mainstream historical fact drifting in like the scent of warm reeds. In much of ancient Nubia, fuel sources were scarce. Trees were limited, brushwood patchy, and people had to rely on whatever the environment offered. Driftwood from the Nile, scrubby shrubs, palm fronds, and even dried animal dung, which was far more efficient than you'd think. A lot less glamorous than chopping wood in a pine forest. But what the desert lacks in romance, it makes up for in practicality. The first thing you and the baker find is a cluster of thorny shrubs, small, stubborn plants that seem to grow out of pure spite. He trims off a few dead branches with a curved blade, dropping them into the basket. The sound is crisp, brittle, like snapping pretzels. You pick up a branch and immediately prick your thumb because of course you do. The baker smirks, the universal expression of, yes, the desert bites back. Welcome. You walk a little farther, and the ground shifts subtly. The sand becomes denser, speckled with small shells carried inland by seasonal floods. It's a reminder that the Nile is not just a river, it's a heartbeat that keeps his civilization going. A faint bird call echoes over the reeds. You turn and spot a fisherman already ankle-deep in water, tossing his net like he's been awake since last week. The baker pauses beside a pile of driftwood, sun-bleached and twisted into shapes that look like abstract sculptures. He selects pieces with practiced eyes, curved sticks, narrow splinters, a branch that looks suspiciously like a ladle. You help by picking up the ones that look lightweight and vaguely useful. The baker nods, approving your choices again. You're 3 for 3 on nods this morning. At this rate, you'll be promoted to assistant baker before the sun even hits peak annoyance. But the fuel run isn't finished. Oh no. He leads you farther from the riverbank until the air becomes warmer, drier, the sand looser. A herd of goats trots past, leaving little pellet-like messages behind. And that's when you realize you're approaching your quirky tidbit of the section. Ancient Nubian bakers often used dried dung as a clean-burning, efficient fuel. Before you make a face, the baker crouches, picks up a perfectly dried disc, lightweight, compact, surprisingly tidy, and tosses it gently into the basket. He gives you a go-on gesture. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hesitate. The goats watch. You reach down, pick up one disc, and are shocked to discover it feels a lot like a chunk of pressed cardboard. The goats seem disappointed you didn't scream. One of them nudges your elbow in solidarity. The baker chuckles softly and mutters something about how fuel is fuel, and you can't argue with that. Fire doesn't judge. Fire just burns. A breeze kicks up, swirling sand around your ankles. The horizon glimmers with that mirage-like shimmer deserts love to flex. You shield your eyes and glance back toward the village. From this distance, the ovens look like tiny domes resting peacefully on the earth, as if they grew naturally out of the ground. The baker adjusts the weight of the basket and resumes walking. The rhythm of your steps syncs with the soft crunch of sand, and you start to understand why this part of the morning is almost meditative. Out here, with no traffic, no notifications, no neighbor trying to learn trumpet at 6 a.m., the desert feels vast but gentle. It's the kind of space that absorbs your leftover stress like a sponge. A handful of children run by, racing each other with reed sticks. One shouts something you can't decipher but probably translates to, "I'm winning." You can't help but smile. Even in the ancient world, competitive chaos at sunrise was a thing. The baker leads you toward a small mound, a place where bits of old pottery and dried plants gather naturally. He picks up a broken ceramic shard, taps it against a larger piece, and listens. You raise an eyebrow. Another oven? A hidden stash? He finally turns and explains. Discarded pottery fragments, when burned, can help stabilize an oven's internal temperature. That's your extra bonus fact of the morning. Ancient recyclers were way ahead of the curve. As you both head back toward the village, the wind shifts, carrying with it the faint earthy aroma of someone already soaking grain for the day's dough. That scent, wet flour meeting warm air, wraps around you like a sleepy hug. The baker glances toward the Nile one more time, scanning for any logs drifting in. Water levels fluctuate after all, and driftwood was a gold mine when it appeared. Historians still argue whether Nubian bakers coordinated with fishermen for driftwood exchange or if it was simply first come, first served. Either way, today the river offers nothing new, so you return with what you've gathered. Brushwood, driftwood, pottery fragments, and your now wildly appreciated dung discs. You reach the courtyard just as the sun climbs above the first rooftop. The baker sets the basket beside the oven, wipes his forearm across his brow, and lets out a satisfied sigh. The universal sign for fuel secured. You mirror the sigh because honestly, gathering firepower in the desert feels like you've just completed a mini side quest. And now comes the real challenge. Turning this random assortment of materials into a steady flame inside a clay dome built with more intention than most of your life decisions. You're standing at the edge of a courtyard where the sand mixes with powdered clay in uneven patches, and small footprints from children and goats crisscross toward the Nile. The first mainstream historical fact drifts in like a stray breeze. In ancient Nubia, dawn wasn't just an early hour, it was peak productivity. People woke before the sun climbed high, partly because heat is a tyrant, but also because work simply made more sense before the day's glare flattened everyone's motivation. The baker gives you one more nod, this one heavier, almost ceremonial, as if to say, good, you're ready to help. You believe him, you really do. Even though part of you is still thinking about the goat judging you for hesitating earlier. You stand there for a second, basking in the glow of your newfound credentials as certified desert fuel collector. Level 1. The baker lifts the basket with a grunt that somehow sounds proud and motions you closer to the oven. This beehive-shaped dome of sun-baked clay that radiates a kind of quiet confidence, like it knows exactly what it's doing and would never ever burn your focaccia. Up close, the oven looks almost alive. The surface is cracked in places, but each crack feels intentional, like wrinkles earned from decades of being extremely good at one job. The opening is small, barely large enough for the baker's forearm and the bundle of brushwood he's holding. Inside, you catch a faint whiff of yesterday's heat, warm, earthy, comforting, like a hug from a terracotta pot. He begins by arranging the brushwood at the very back of the chamber, and he does it with the same precision you'd expect from someone adjusting gemstones in a crown. You help by handing over a few pieces of driftwood, and he places them on top, forming a neat little fuel pyramid. You didn't know fuel pyramids were a thing, but here you are, witnessing ancient engineering in action. And here's your dose of mainstream historical context. These dome ovens, tanners or tabans in various regions, were beloved across North Africa and the Near East for their ability to hit and sustain high temperatures using minimal fuel. Heat efficiency was the name of the game, especially in places like Nubia where every scrap of burnable stuff mattered. The design wastes nothing, hoards heat like a dragon, and bakes bread faster than you can say, preheat to 450. The baker steps back, grabs a pottery shard, and uses it to scrape yesterday's ash into a little pile. You notice how he sorts the ash with care. Some goes into a clay bowl for tomorrow's cleaning, but a portion, lighter, finer, warmer in color, gets pushed into a corner of the oven. Why? Because it acts as a makeshift insulator, holding heat while preventing the base of the oven from scorching the dough too quickly. You raise your eyebrows impressed. The baker smirks with the same energy someone might use after revealing their grandma's unbeatable secret pie crust recipe. Yeah, ancient bakers had tricks. Lots of them. Next comes a spark. Not a match, obviously, but a glowing ember carried from a neighbor's fire. Borrowing fire was a whole communal practice, a sign of interdependence. You watch as the baker sets the ember into the nest of brushwood and then gently blows, encouraging the flame like you'd encourage a sleepy toddler to stand up. The wood catches with a soft, crackling sigh. A curl of smoke dances out of the oven's mouth, lazy and fragrant. The heat begins to grow fast, like, you should not put your face there anymore. Fast. You take a small step back, and the baker laughs. Not unkindly, more like, yes, the oven is awake now. Respect the oven. He lets the fire burn hot for a few minutes, feeding it with a dried dung disc. The smell is actually not bad, more like a warm, dusty incense. A little grassy, a little nostalgic, for a life you never actually lived but are suddenly convinced you remember. The baker you're shadowing agrees. He gives you a nod that says, you're late, even though you're clearly the earliest person awake in your entire apartment building. While the oven heats, the baker steps aside and fetches a clay bowl covered with a linen cloth. He lifts the cloth with a flourish that says, behold, and inside dough, smooth, airy, risen into a gentle dome, ready for its big moment. The dough smells faintly sour in the best way, like something alive and content. And here comes your quirky but true fact of the section. Ancient Nubian bakers often kneaded dough with a mix of domestic and wild grains, emmer, barley, sorghum, giving their bread a dense, nutty profile that modern foodies would absolutely write passionate blog posts about. Depending on the era and region, some bakers even mixed pulverized acacia seeds into the dough for extra depth and nutrition. The desert wasn't stingy, you just had to know where to look. The baker pinches off a chunk and hands it to you. It's sticky and warm from fermentation, and it clings to your fingers like it has commitment issues. He gestures for you to start shaping it. Simple rounds, no fancy scoring, no sourdough hipster energy. Just gently flatten, smooth the edges, and set aside. Your first attempt looks like a lopsided sand dollar. The baker nods anyway. He has accepted you and your misshapen creation. Soon, a small row of dough rounds sits on a reed mat beside the oven. The heat from the chamber spills into the air, making the dough surface slightly firmer, prepping it for the slap. Ah yes, the slap. This is the moment bakers from Egypt to Nubia to Mesopotamia mastered, sticking dough to the inner wall of a blazing hot oven. No trays, no racks, just vertical baking like a culinary magic trick. The baker grabs a dough round, moistens one side with his fingertips, and with a swift, confident motion, slaps it onto the inside of the oven. It sticks instantly, clinging to the hot clay like a koala to a tree. You stare. The baker gestures for you to try, his expression way too calm for what you're pretty sure is an ancient Olympic sport. You inhale, take a dough round, moist the back, lean in, not too close unless you want your eyebrows singed off, and slap. It sticks. He pads toward his clay oven, a humble dome about waist high, patched with different shades of mud from years of repairs. If you squint, you can see faint handprints dried into the surface. Someone's kids helped at some point. Or maybe someone pressed their palm there absent-mindedly while gossiping. You nearly cheer. The baker does, in fact, give you a small celebratory nod. You're racking up nods like reward points at this point. More dough rounds go up. Each one puffs within minutes, tiny blisters forming on the surface, edges curling slightly as they crisp. The smell is heavenly, nutty, warm, deep, almost caramelized from the fire's intensity. And somehow, even though the sun is getting higher and the day is heating up, you feel calm, focused, like you've synced up with a rhythm older than cities, older than kings. Just hands, dough, fire, clay. When the first bread is ready, the baker reaches in with a long iron hook, peels it off the wall, and drops it into your hands. It's hot enough to make you juggle it like someone who deeply regrets not wearing thicker calluses. But it's perfect. Soft interior, crisp edges, tiny toasted freckles from the clay. You take a bite. And for one quiet, absurdly grounding moment, everything, past, present, worries, to-do lists, gets swallowed by the simple fact that this bread is really good. The baker grins, pleased. And just like that, the rest of the day feels like it's going to unfold at exactly the speed it needs to. You wander deeper into the heat-soaked day, and the sun climbs to that familiar, I'm not joking, height above you. The Nubian bakers don't even flinch, because you, trailing behind them with your slightly dramatic inner monologue, are about to learn one of the most underrated arts in ancient culinary engineering, dealing with a desert wind that behaves like it's auditioning for a sandblasting commercial. And yeah, you will absolutely get a face full of sand at least once, because that's part of the charm. You're welcome. Historians still argue whether these ovens developed locally or were gradually influenced by Egyptian designs drifting south along the Nile. You'll hear scholars debating it like it's the world's coziest academic quarrel. Either way, here it stands. Warm, welcoming, a sturdy companion for someone who's about to spend the next 12 hours turning dough into the stuff of life. By midday, the wind picks up, humming against the mud brick walls like a low, raspy whisper. You duck behind the workshop's narrow shade wall, a clever structure you might have dismissed earlier as just another lump of mud. It's actually a calculated windbreak, one of many subtle tricks baked, pun intended, into Nubian oven yards. A mainstream historical fact here. Ancient Nubians often oriented their courtyards and ovens to take advantage of prevailing winds along the Nile corridor, sometimes angling the oven's mouth to reduce how much gusts interfered with heating efficiency. It's the kind of thing you only appreciate when you're standing here shielding your eyes from airborne grit, suddenly understanding their priorities on a personal level. You watch as a baker adjusts a woven reed screen, lightweight, kind of rickety, but surprisingly effective. It filters the gusts just enough to keep the flames steady without suffocating them. The wind itself is still carrying sand, though, swirling around in little eddies on the ground like tiny desert spirits who got bored and decided to form a dance troupe. You step around one and immediately get smacked by another. The bakers, zero sympathy, just snicker. That's joke number one, we're pacing ourselves. They show you how oven positioning is chosen. Away from wide open dunes, tucked beside mud brick homes, angled to catch cooler river breezes, but avoid the harsher desert drafts. That delicate balance matters because these ovens depend on consistent radiant heat, not chaotic gust-induced flare-ups. Historians still argue whether Nubians learned this placement strategy from repeated trial and error over generations, or whether the knowledge was passed along more formally within families. Either way, when you see a little puff of sand skip across the oven's mouth and vanish without disturbing the fire, you can tell the design is dialed in. One baker taps the side of the oven with a stick, just a light knock, and listens. The sound, hollow but warm, tells her how the wind is affecting the interior temperature. You have no idea how she hears any difference, but she does, and she's not about to explain the nuance to a newcomer who's still blinking sand out of their eyelashes. She adjusts the fuel slightly, adding a handful of dry brush that burns quick and lively. Another quirky tidbit, some Nubian bakers use small piles of pulverized date pits as a slow-burning heat stabilizer. They smell faintly sweet when they catch fire, giving the workspace a surprisingly pleasant scent. Kind of a natural aromatherapy session, except you're also sweating and dodging dust devils, so the spa vibe is interpretive. The sandstorm-like conditions keep shifting. The wind isn't constant. It surges, falls, drifts, repositions like it's trying to psych you out. The bakers adapt in real time, adjusting airflow by shifting pottery shards that act as makeshift vents. You help with one, sliding it a few inches, and immediately get a polite correction. Apparently you moved it in the enthusiastic but wrong direction. That's joke number two. You take it gracefully because, well, they're right. The oven's outer clay coating, cracked in places but sturdy, helps buffer temperature changes. You run your fingers over the texture, grainy, sun-baked, warm, but not scalding. Wind-blown sand has polished some areas smooth over years of abrasion, giving the oven a soft sheen that looks almost intentional. It reminds you of those distressed furniture pieces modern folks pay too much for, except this is actual, nature-driven design, not a guy with sandpaper. Joke number three, quota met.